Hi, first English learners. Kumusta kayo? If you speak Tagalog, tell me how bad I sounded just now. And namaste to my Indian viewers. You guys who are watching this can also tell me where you're from in the comments because I'm curious to know. This is another video that's part of the Reading with Marcus series. This time, we'll be looking at CELPIP Reading Part 4, Reading for Viewpoints. So I picked this because many of you said that it's the most difficult part of the reading test. This video should be useful for you guys. Here, I will discuss the paragraphs with you and talk about what's important to note while reading. Then we will continue with the questions. Today's reading practice is taken from the free CELPIP practice that you get when you sign up for a new account at celpip.ca. It's called Starter Set B. So if you want, you can also open the reading practice there. For more reading practice, you can also get our exclusive CELPIP reading ebook that contains lots of skill building questions and 5 mock tests. Go to our website www.pressenglish.com/training to purchase it and join our online training as well. With the training bundle, you will save even more. Take a few minutes to read this passage. You can pause the video too if you need more time, but in the actual test, you have 13 minutes to complete this part. That is the time you have to read the passage and answer the questions. So after reading the first paragraph, we should already know what the passage is going to talk about. Here in the paragraph, we learn how the government has been increasingly withdrawn its support for visual and performing arts across the country. Because we're reading Viewpoints, we can expect that there will be some people who are supporting this funding cut, and there will be some others who are against the funding cut. So let's take a look at the next paragraph. Here we come across a name, Miriam Donahue. So when I see a name, I like to make a note of where that appears, because the questions will often ask about the opinions of people. So it might help you find the answer faster when you know or when you remember where that name is being mentioned in the article. So here, Miriam Donahue appears in paragraph 2. Let's have a look at the statements that she made. Society doesn't accept government intervention in other economic sectors. Art should be no different. The intervention distorts the market. Artists should be more entrepreneurial and obtain money from the private sector. And then government shouldn't be in the business of selecting which artist is fittest for public consumption. So from all the statements, I think we can safely assume that Miriam Donahue, actually let me ask you that before I tell you the answer. What do you think is Miriam Donahue's opinion on the funding cut? Does she support the funding cut or is she against the funding cut? So we should know that she supports the funding cut. She thinks that government shouldn't be providing funding for arts. Then let's move on to the next paragraph. Understandably, artists have resisted. Then we come across another name, Katarina Bakir. She says, it's not realistic to imagine that private sponsorship and philanthropy are a panacea to replace government funding. It's not realistic. So that's a strong statement already. And businesses see government support of the arts as a stamp of approval, ensuring high standards of quality and integrity. With government cutbacks, the private sector has actually been more reluctant to sponsor events and artists. Earnings for Canadian artists are hovering around poverty level. If funding cuts continue, artists will have to choose between falling further into poverty or changing professions. So all of these statements are pointing towards one opinion. What is it? So here, Katarina Bakir is against the funding cuts. She thinks that the funding from the government is very essential. The artists need that to survive, and all of the other things that she mentioned along with it. And the last paragraph brings up another person, another individual, Dr. Peter Horvath. She agrees that artists need entrepreneurial skills and sees many social benefits to public patronage for the arts. So that statements kind of support both views, but let's keep going. The arts often accused of being elitist, but surveys show that Canadians actually prefer artistic events to live sports. By funding arts, government create a shared meaning and a joint understanding of our country's values. And supporting the arts provide a common good in the form of public shows and events, but it also enhances our cohesiveness as a community. It fosters a healthy society. Okay, so from the last few statements, the last few sentences, we can conclude that Dr. Peter Horvath also supports funding for arts. Okay, so now we have these three people. To summarize, Miriam Donahue doesn't support government funding, and Katarina Bakir supports government funding, and lastly, Dr. Peter Horvath also supports government funding, even though he also mentions that artists need entrepreneurial skills. All right, so now let's take a look at our first question. The article is mainly about blank. Well, we've talked about it. So the passage is discussing government funding for the arts sector. So the closest to that would be D, whether working artists deserve government sponsorship. If I rephrase this, maybe I can say whether artists should receive government funding. So that is the thesis of this article. It's not about the value of art. It's not why the private sector should financially support artists. It did mention that, but that's not the main idea. Whether artists should rely on themselves or on charities, that's not true either, because the central point of this is government's role in the arts sector. Let's move on to question number 2. So paragraph 1 provides which of the following? Description of various types of performing art. That's definitely not the case. Even though it mentions visual and performing art, that's not the information we get. Few pieces of background information. That seems to be the answer, but let's continue read option C and D. Good example of the problem that follows. No, we don't see an example either here. And brief historical overview of Canadian artists. Nope, it's not talking about Canadian artists in that first paragraph. So I know for sure now that B is the right answer. Few pieces of background information. All right. In the first paragraph, we learned that in the past, the Canadian government has been providing funding for visual and performing arts. But then, in recent times, this government funding has been going down. And then we also learned that some groups are also against this government funding in arts. So those are the pieces of background information we get from paragraph 1. Moving on to question 3. Miriam Donahue's views would likely be supported by blank. So now I have to remember what Miriam Donahue's views are. What is her opinion? So we learned earlier that Miriam is actually against the government funding. She wants the government funding to stop. So let's see if we can eliminate any of the wrong options. So based on that, option A and C should be the wrong answers because these are people who rely on the government funding. A, administrators working for a government-funded arts council. They would want the funding to continue. And C, dance organizations relying on government sponsorships. They need money from the government to survive. So that leaves us with B or D. B, corporations dedicated to funding overseas health initiatives. This doesn't seem to be related to our topic here. And D, Canadian residents interested mainly in spectator sports. Okay, so if I have to choose the best answer, I would go with D. Even though I'm not 100% in agreement actually with this statement, because Miriam Donahue also probably thinks that government should not provide funding to sports either. So if the government stops the funding for arts, it doesn't mean that sports will be a sector that receives funding going forward. But given that we have to choose the best answer, I would go with D. Canadian residents interested mainly in spectator sports. Now, question 4. Bakir thinks that implementing Donahue's ideas would lead to blank. So if you remember, Katarina Bakir has the opposite view. So she supports government funding. So let's take a look at the options. A decrease in the number of working artists. That seems to be a possible answer. B, a decrease in government income tax rates. The paragraph doesn't talk about income tax rate, so that's not the answer. C, an increase in the quality and integrity of art. That's probably not either. An increase in private funding for the arts. I don't think that's the answer. So I would go with A, a decrease in the number of working artists. Then if I want to double check, I would go back to the paragraph that mentions this. So if we stop government funding, the earnings for professional Canadian artists who are already at this lower level will go down even further. Artists will have to choose between poverty or changing professions. So if that happens, then we probably will lose working artists, which leads us to answer A, a decrease in the number of working artists. I hope that's clear. Number 5, the author's tone indicates support for blank. So we have to look at the author's tone, not the views of the people mentioned, but the opinion or the view of the author himself or herself. So probably I have to look at words that show the author's tone. One example would be this. Unfortunately, in the face of difficult fiscal choices, the government has increasingly withdrawn its support. So it seems like the author is disappointed that the support from the government has been reduced. Or maybe this point, understandably, artists have resisted. So the author understands why the artists resist this change or this idea that government funding should be cut. If that's not enough, maybe we can look at the people mentioned in his or her article. So Miriam Donahue is against the funding cut, but it seems like the other two people, Katarina Bakir and Dr. Peter Horvath, seem to support the government funding. So we have two people who support government funding and one person who's against. So based on all this evidence, I would say that the author supports government funding. Let's see if we can find an option that shows that. So eliminating public funding of visual and performing arts, that's the opposite of what we're looking for. B, government commitment to supporting Canadian artists. That seems to be what I want, but let's keep going for now. C, increase public participation in local arts organizations. We're not talking about public participation. We're talking about government's participation. And D, private sector funding for the arts across Canada. So C and D are actually similar enough. So both are wrong in this case. That confirms my answer that B is the correct one. That is the first half of reading part 4. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel if you like this video so far. And click the bell icon to get a notification when we post a new video. You know, we always appreciate your support. You guys are the reason we keep making the CELPIP videos. We've helped hundreds of students get the CELPIP score they needed, and we want to help you too. Remember, our online training starts every Monday, so sign up before the seats are full. We give our students individual feedback, so we have to limit the number of participants in each training session. Let's continue with the second part. The second part is fill in the blank questions. You're given a text that is a comment from a reader of the passage, the article that we just read. The questions will revolve around the opinions of the people. So take a few minutes to read this comment from a reader. So in the first paragraph, we get a little bit of information about the writer of this comment. He is a musician, but he's been struggling to get funding for his tour from the government. So he's probably disappointed. The funding seemed to have gone to only classical ballet, operas, and symphony orchestras. Okay, now let's take a look at the first statement that we have to complete. So Miriam Donahue strikes a chord with me when she says government that fund the arts blank. So before I talk about the answers, I want to point out something important. When we read this part, when we read the statements, I want you to pay attention to the keywords that will help us find what the right answers are. So in this case, the keyword is this, strikes a chord with me. To strike a chord means to connect, to sympathize. If I say Miriam Donahue strikes a chord with me, then I agree with something that she has said. So to complete the statement, I need to find something that's in agreement with what she said. Here are the choices. A, do so without economic intervention. B, pay for the pastimes of the elite. C, undervalue the work of modern musicians. And D, support administrators rather than artists. So A is not the right answer because government funding itself is a form of economic intervention. So remember that Miriam Donahue doesn't support government funding, but the writer is a musician who wants to receive funding from the government. So it cannot be A. I have to find a statement that is in agreement with Miriam Donahue, but it's something that the writer of the comment will also agree with. B. Pay for the pastimes of the elite. Pay for the hobbies of the rich people. So this seems to be the right answer for me, because in the second paragraph, I see this statement. When that happens, taxpayers subsidize the leisure pursuits of society's wealthiest people. This sounds like a paraphrase of this statement. But let's keep going. C. Undervalue the work of modern musicians. Miriam Donahue doesn't talk about the value of the work of the musicians. And D. Support administrators rather than the artists. And the reading doesn't even talk about the administrators. So B seems to be the right answer for me. It pays for the government funding pays for the pastimes of the elite. Now let's take a look at question 7. However, blank, I'm wary of Miss Donahue's advice. Our brand of heavy metal music is a very small niche and doesn't appeal to the mass market. It's hard to imagine it would appeal to the suits who are your typical corporate donors. So again, I think the important keyword here is however. So the statement is going to show a contrast. I'm wary of Miss Donahue's advice. So that tells me that he disagrees with the advice from Ms. Donahue. The next part talks about how hard it is for people in his genre of music to get funding from the private sector, because the suits, so the suits here are referring to people who work in companies because they tend to wear suits at the office, are not good. How hard it is to get the support from these people, because maybe it's not the kind of music that the suits are into. Now let's take a look at the options. Due to her lack of information on the issue. I don't think she lacks information, because she was asked during an interview, so she probably is like an expert in this field, and she also came from Canadian Taxpayers League. But let's check option B, similar to Miss Katerina Bakir. Remember that the writer of the comments concern is that he won't be able to secure funding because not many people are interested in this kind of music that he makes. So this statement here, businesses see government support of the arts as a stamp of approval, ensuring high standards of quality and integrity. With government cutbacks, the private sector has actually been more reluctant to sponsor events and artists. So I think this is the right answer. Oops. It's a statement that contrasts Miriam Donahue's statement, and it's in agreement with what Ms. Katerina Bakir has said. So question 8. Let's read this part. It's hard to imagine it would appeal to the suits who are your typical corporate donors. That's why I questioned Ms. Donahue's opinion that blank. The key word here is that's why I question Ms. Donahue's opinion. Because my answer here has to be an opinion from Ms. Donahue that the writer disagrees with. So let's have a look at the options. Option A, artists should produce practical things. So Ms. Donahue doesn't really talk about the practicality of arts. So that's probably not the answer we want. B, free handouts distort the true meaning of art. Well, if you refer to the passage, it says government intervention distorts the market. So that's what Ms. Donahue thinks. But the writer of the comment doesn't really talk about the value, the true meaning of art. So it doesn't seem to be the answer we're looking at either. C, government should have good taste. Well, I think this is one of those obvious answers that you should know right away that it's the wrong answer because we're not talking about the taste of government. And D, private philanthropy can sustain the arts. So Ms. Donahue says that artists should rely more on money from the private sector. Here, obtain money from the private sector. But we know that it's hard for musicians like the writer of the comment who works in the music industry, especially in the heavy metal music, because it's a very small niche, so it's super hard to get the support from the private sector. So based on that, I should know that the answer is D. Private philanthropy can sustain the arts. Question 9. Blank Ms. Bakir's prediction, that is to survive economically, I may genuinely have to blank. So in this short paragraph or in this short sentence, what keyword should I pay attention to? I think it's this one here. That is. So if I see that is here, I know that in number 9, I need to find a statement that is in agreement with what Ms. Bakir said. And it's actually going to relate to the following statement. To survive economically, I may have to do something. So let's have a look at our options. Moreover, I'm also doubtful of Ms. Bakir's prediction. Thus, I could become an example of Ms. Bakir's prediction. Unfortunately, I have to disagree with Ms. Bakir's prediction, and D, indeed, Ms. Donahue does share Ms. Bakir's prediction. So I know that D is wrong right at the bat because Ms. Bakir and Ms. Donahue disagree with each other. And C, unfortunately, I have to disagree with Ms. Bakir. Well, what is Ms. Bakir's view? What is Ms. Bakir's prediction? So I need to find out what her prediction is. Let's have a look at the paragraph, the third paragraph that talks about her. So this is probably his prediction. If funding cuts continue, artists will have to choose between falling further into poverty or changing professions. So will the writer of the comment disagree with that? No, because the writer of the comment actually mentioned something similar. It's hard for him to find funding. So if he cannot get funding, he might have to quit his job or he has to live in poverty. So C is not the right answer either. And B, thus, I could be an example of Ms. Bakir's prediction. So in this case, that should be the right answer. A is also wrong. Moreover, I'm also doubtful. Well, if he's doubtful, he would not make this statement here. Our brand of heavy metal would not appeal to the suits. See, that confirms my answer, B. And number 10. So we've read the statement earlier. That is to survive economically, I generally may have to blank. So this relates to the prediction again that Ms. Katarina Bakir made. Let's see the options. A, cut back on my unnecessary spending. That's likely. B, give up on my dream just to pay the rent. That's likely too. C, produce music of a lower quality standard. No, he's not talking about lowering the music quality. And D, seek funds from more conservative donors. That's not the case either because he basically said it's hard to get funding, period. So it's either A or B. Cut back on my unnecessary spending because it's hard to make money. He might have to do that. But is that related to Ms. Bakir's prediction? not so much compared to B, which is to give up on my dream just to pay the rent. Giving up on my dream would be similar to saying changing professions. Music is his dream, but because he's not making enough money, he has to give up being a musician. So B is the right answer. Excellent. We now have completed all the questions in task 4. What did you guys learn from this video? Let me know in the comments. And before you continue with your study, please like this video. It would really help us to produce more videos like this in the future. And lastly, if you have been struggling to get the score you need, stop wasting your time and money retaking the test. Trust me, I know how frustrating it is, and I am here to help. So sign up today for our 7-day CELPIP online training at prestoenglish.com and get personalized feedback during the session, not just general tips and strategies. I'll see you in our next training session. Bye!